Hello and welcome back to Your Story Stinks. Although this is going to be a bit of a crossover episode with myths, mysteries, and more, because today we're going to be talking about Pinocchio. Now, I originally wasn't going to do this, but one of my friends grabbed me and was like, hey, you need to watch this, you're going to hate it. And, I sat down and I watched the new Disney Pinocchio, and I did indeed hate it. And it was bad enough that I thought, you know what, I haven't done an episode of this in a while because I've been moving and dealing with life. This sounds like a great episode to come back on. Because, oh my god, this movie is absolutely atrocious. But before we really get into it, I need to create a few caveats, because I've sat down and I looked at a few other people's reviews to see what other people were thinking about it, and they also hated it, but I wanted to see what sort of through lines I could draw, like similarities that people were harping on. And I found a few, and I'm not even sure if they're entirely accurate. Because everybody that I looked at who was talking about this movie talks about it as a remake. And I guess that makes sense, because Disney has already made a Pinocchio movie before in the 50s, I think. Like, everyone's seen the animated Pinocchio that they did, and so they talk about this like it's a remake, and I'm not exactly sure that's accurate. In fact, I kind of oppose the notion that these are remakes. I'm going to call it a remake just for simplicity's sake, but none of the quote-unquote Disney remakes are remakes in, like, the traditional sense. Like, it's almost because they're not their original stories, so they can't really be remakes. Like, calling the new Pinocchio movie a remake of the 1950 version is sort of like if you called the 1950s version the remake of the original story. Because it's not trying to be a remake, it's redoing the story, but it's not trying to remake the same movie because they're not retelling the same story. And I know it sounds like I've contradicted myself, but what I'm trying to get at is that they use the same characters and they use the same source material, but the 1950s version and this one are telling entirely different stories with the same source material. I'm not sure if that's intended, but I'm going to get into that. But yeah, this is like something that is kind of similar with all of the Disney live-action movies, where they're not really remaking their own movies, because they change major plot points to the point that the stories aren't even, like, similar or, like, connected in any way, it feels like. Mulan is a good example. Like, Mulan, they just remove major characters and change entire character moments and plot threads to the point where I'm not even sure that you can call it a remake. Like, the same thing is true with The Lion King, where it feels more like it's trying to be a nature documentary because of how it's shot than a remake of the animated Lion King. The Jungle Book is almost the same way, though the Jungle Book is probably the closest to being a quote-unquote remake, where it uses the majority of the stuff from the animated version. But most of these movies are not really remakes, like, at all, because they don't really tell the same story. It would be so much better if they just told the same stories. Like, if they just took the scripts from the animated version and just reshot them. The movies would probably be way better. But they don't do that, and in the case of Pinocchio, it's almost, like, insane about how much work they clearly put in to do something that's objectively worse than the 1950s version. Because the 1950s version, whether you like it or hate it, I'm sort of ambivalent about it, is at least decent in most people's minds. I think that most of the movies of the old Disney canon, like Bambi, Snow White, Pinocchio, those movies, I think most of them are not really movies that most people actually like. What I mean by that is that when most people think of them, they think of, like, individual scenes that stand out, And that's their entire opinion of the entire movie. Like, they don't remember anything else from the movie. So for, like, Pinocchio, all anybody ever remembers is when you wish upon a star and the scene on Pleasure Island where they turn into donkeys. And that's, like, their entire memory of the movie. They don't remember anything else that goes on in the movie or any other plot moments. That's, like, the only... Like, if you just cut those two scenes out, that's most people's entire knowledge or all they remember from the movie. You know, Snow White is similar, where she's dancing with the birds and then she gets kissed by the prince, and that's basically all anyone remembers. With Bambi, it's, oh, his mother gets shot, and that's the entirety of their knowledge and memory of Bambi. And so Pinocchio is kind of the same way, where that's all anyone remembers. And so in the modern day, when we're talking about remaking this movie, like, those are the only two scenes you really need. Because if you nail those two scenes, the rest of the movie could be average. No one would care. You know, if you just nail those two scenes, you're fine. But what's weird is that they go out of their way to do more work, to change things, almost to be more accurate to the book. And it's weird, because the book is not very good. So here's where we veer into myths, mysteries, and more, because I'm going to briefly talk about the book, because it's not very good, and if I tried to sum up the whole thing, we would be here for an hour. So here's the thing. The book was made in 1883, and one thing that I don't think a lot of people really appreciate is how far we've come in terms of storytelling, because books like The Adventures of Pinocchio that were written for children were essentially just collections of smaller stories put together. And so The Adventures of Pinocchio is very much an and then story. What I mean by that is that when you're telling a story, or when you're describing how a story goes, there are phrases that you use that can tell you if it's good or bad. And then is a bad one. What you really want to say is something like, but then, or therefore. And this is not merely a way of speaking, this is an important way to understand stories. So let me explain. Take the animated Pinocchio movie, okay? They're going to Pleasure Island, right? Because they want to have fun. And so they're doing all of these wild things, smashing stuff, smoking and drinking. But then they start turning into donkeys, and therefore they learn why sinning is bad. Okay, see what I did there? Whereas in The Adventures of Pinocchio, they go to Pleasure Island, and then they're there for 5 months, and then they start turning into donkeys because they have donkey fever, because donkey fever is what boys get when they don't study for 5 months. And then they're sold to a circus, and then he sprains his leg, and then he's sold, and then he's skinned and turned into a drum. And, like, you see what I'm going, where it goes, and then, because nothing is progressing. There's no cause and effect. It's just, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. Like, there's no progression. Nothing really relates to anything else in the story. And so The Adventures of Pinocchio, because it's such an old story, and like most old stories, is kind of told this way, where things just happen. Like, if I was sitting down and trying to explain to you the amount of nonsense in the original Pinocchio story, we would be here forever. For example, there's an entire sequence where Pinocchio goes to a town where all of the inhabitants are animals, and then he gets robbed, and then he goes to the sheriff, who is an animal, and then the sheriff arrests him because it's a crime to be stolen from. So then he's in prison, and then he gets out of prison, and then he goes down the road, and then he meets a snake, and then he falls over, and then the snake laughs at him and bursts an artery and dies. And they're like, this is the whole story. This is how the story goes. Just one thing after another. And this is not a good way to tell stories. This is why modern storytelling tries to get away from this. Because the nature of plot, the nature of how we write plots, requires us to have cause and effect so that we understand that characters are changing and that things that happen are affecting the characters. And it doesn't even have to be the main character. Something just has to be happening. You don't even need the main character to change. The main character could stay the same, and things around the character can change. But something has to change. There has to be an arc. You need a plot to tell a story. Okay? And the plot is based on cause and effect. It's based around things happening that are connected to each other. If you start telling a story and you keep going and then, what this means is that the events that you're discussing have no bearing on each other. Nothing is connected to each other. Nothing is changing. Nothing is developing. They're just happening in a void, basically. And so when I talk about this, and when I said earlier that the new Pinocchio movie is a lot like the book, this is what I mean, because the new Pinocchio movie is also an and then story. Because everything that happens is just, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, over and over and over again. It's like he's in the workshop and they have a musical number, and there are references to other movies, and then he meets the fox and the cat, and then they kind of sort of tell him to do things, and then he leaves, and then they go to Pleasure Island, and then there's like a bunch of stuff where that just kind of happens, like it's Willy Wonka's chocolate factory or something, and then, you know, they turn into donkeys, and then he leaves, and he's swallowed by a monster, and then he meets Geppetto, who's in the ocean for some reason, and then, like, this is how the whole movie is structured, and it's bad on its own. So to bring this all back around, this is why I say it's not really a remake. Because if it was a remake, they could just follow the plot of the original. Because the original Pinocchio, the animated version anyway, is very much a complete story. There is cause and effect. And the reason for this is that it's a morality tale. Morality tales are great for structuring your story because you have a very clear beginning, middle, and end. Okay, morality tales are some of the simplest stories you can possibly tell. Okay, and Pinocchio works because you have a child as your main character, and children don't know things, and so you have Pinocchio, who is a child, who is a boy, who can then learn how to be a good person, and because he learns how to become a real person, or a good person, he can become a real boy. That's the arc, okay? So the whole story is he begins life as kind of a pure, unknowing character. And then he does bad things, he is punished for those bad things, or bad things happen to those people around him. He learns and grows as a character, and then he becomes a real boy. That's the arc. Okay? And it works. And it works for telling a story. But the new Pinocchio throws that out the window and decides, actually, we're going to want our character to be a moral paragon who is the same in the beginning, the middle, and the end. What that means is that every time something happens, he's always aware that it's bad. So he doesn't do it. He's sort of like cajoled or forced into situations where he is the moral voice for everyone else. And that could work. You can still tell a morality tale, but they don't. So what you have is a morality tale story without the morality tale, which is why it's an and then story. So now we have all of the morality tale situations, but we've removed the morality tale elements. So nothing fits, and so events just sort of happen. He meets the fox and the cat who tried to scam him, but because he's a moral paragon, he automatically knows that they're scam artists, and so he doesn't really go along with them, and then they just disappear from the story, because without him being duped by them, nothing is happening. Okay, he goes to Pleasure Island, but because he already knows that indulging in all these pleasures is bad, he's not learning or growing. Now, you could tell a story where your main character is a moral paragon in this situation. But to do that, you would need to turn him into a Cassandra. What I mean by that is I'm referencing the Greek mythology Cassandra, who was cursed by Apollo to know the future, but no one would believe her. And she famously told the Trojans that the Greeks are going to give them a gift, and it's going to be a trap. And she's like, that's, the Trojan horse, and there's Greeks inside of it, and you're all going to die. And they're like, that's crazy. She's crazy. We don't need to listen to her. That's what a Cassandra figure is. And so you could turn Pinocchio into a figure where he's like telling everyone around him, don't do this, and then they don't believe him, and then bad things happen to them. Okay, you could tell a story like that. But that's not the story they're telling. Okay, they're trying to keep all of the same plot points from their animated version and from the book without having the morality tale elements. And so things just come and go, and there's no real, like progression. There's no real development, and so the audience is sort of left feeling empty. You're like, why is this here? Why are we watching this? What's the point to any of this? Now, I do want to be clear about something, which is that the book and the animated version have two different morality tales. So this can be done, okay, because they already did it once. The book is written at a time where the prevailing moral theory, at least by the author, is that people are born evil, essentially. And so, if left to their own devices, they will get up to mischief and do bad things. Okay? So, Pinocchio, who is literally carved out of a block of wood, is naturally inclined to do bad things, and so he needs to be taught, both through example and through experience, to do good things, which is why he becomes a real boy at the end. Okay? Like, everything that he does, and he does some really bad things, are understandable when you realize that he basically has no moral compass other than the fact that his innate urge is to be a kid, basically. So it's like, he finds a magic cricket, and the magic cricket is like, you should be moral, and Pinocchio, being a child, is like, that's boring, and kills the cricket. He's like, he meets a fox and a cat, and the fox and the cat are like, hey, you have these gold coins, if you bury them in this place, a money tree will grow. And Pinocchio is, again, a block of wood, has no experience with scammers or anyone else, and so he's like, yeah, that sounds about right. And then he goes and does it, and he's robbed. And so he learns that you can't always trust everybody. These are lessons of morality for children. That's the nature of the story. Okay? The animated version does something similar, but they change it slightly. So in the book, they assume that human nature is basically that you're evil and you'll do bad things automatically if you're not taught to do good things. Whereas the Disney version, the animated one, assumes that you're a blank slate. So what that means is that Pinocchio is influenced by who he's around. Okay, so when he's around Geppetto on his own, he does good things. But when he's around, his best friend, when he's around the fox and the cat, he does less than good things. Because he is easily influenced by those people who are around him in the moment. Furthermore, he is very much a regular kid. So he is inclined to do things that are fun and less inclined to listen to the cricket, who is trying to keep him on the straight and narrow, essentially. He doesn't want to listen to the cricket telling him he should go home and be a good boy. He wants to smash things and drink booze and smoke cigars. He wants to do whatever he wants. He doesn't want to listen to this nagging cricket. And so, it's understandable where he's being influenced by bad people, and then he learns a lesson because of it. He learns that he can't always listen to the people who are trying to sell you the things that seem good to you. He is essentially a blank slate, and he becomes good and then becomes a real boy when he chooses to be a good person, basically. Again, two different morality tales, but they are still morality tales. The new Pinocchio just removes this, as I've said, and so, as a result, there's no real, motivation for Pinocchio. There's no rhyme or reason to what he does. Things just happen around him, and he just sort of goes along with it. And it's not very interesting. Now, the other thing about it is that, they remove major plot points from both the book and the animated version. So, when he lies, his nose grows. This is a thing. Okay? But because they've removed the morality tale part of it, in this one, his nose growing is not just a good thing, but it gets them out of danger, essentially. They use it as a plot point to get out of a problem. And it's that completely defeats the point of why his nose grows. Okay? The reason his nose grows is because it's meant to be like the Scarlet Letter, basically. It's meant to show that he's done something and he can't hide it. Okay? It's meant to essentially be an exterior representation of a sin that he's committed. And so, by turning it into a helpful, useful thing, you've undercut the whole reason it exists in the first place. Again, it's a morality tale without the morality tale, and so there's nothing left. And it's baffling, because they've done so much more work than they needed to with this movie. In fact, it would be a better movie if it was a remake. If they were just remaking the animated one shot for shot, line for line. They kept all the line, they just redid the script, and then they reshot everything shot for shot. It would be a better movie. Because they've essentially tried to make their own movie and do their own thing, and it's unclear that they understand the basics of storytelling. They don't seem to understand the basics of why or how events come together. They don't seem to grasp the very basics of cause and effect, or the basics of what a plot is. Because if you sit down and just try to write out what the plot is, you'll realize that there isn't one. Because a plot is, in the most simple definition I can provide, something acts on something else, and we, as the audience, want to know why. Okay, that is the simplest definition of a plot I can give you. Because you need these three elements. You need at least two elements, something and something else, acting upon each other, or one acting upon the other, and we as the audience then need to know why, or at least want to know why, because otherwise, it's just events happening. If something doesn't happen in a way that we have questions, you haven't told a story. You've just told us events. Okay? Pinocchio going to the store is not a story. Okay? Him just doing it is not a story. If that's all you put, it's not a story. It's just something happening. Okay? Pinocchio going to Pleasure Island is not a story. It's just something that happens. Okay? He's not acting on anything. Nothing is acting on him. Nothing is acting on anything else around him. It's just there. And so, because nothing is acting on anything else, we don't want to know why, because we don't care. Because we're not given a reason to care. There's no hook to grab us and make us want to know why this is all happening to him. Why are things happening? Okay? It's to contrast it with the animated version again, when he goes to Pleasure Island, he, begins acting out. he is acting upon his environment. Okay? He smashes things. He drinks. He is indulging in the pleasures of Pleasure Island. And as a result, we want to see what happens to him. Okay? And then we do. We've been hooked by this whole experience because he wants to go to Pleasure Island and act out. And Jiminy Cricket says, no, don't do that. And so he's acting on his environment. And we, as the audience, knowing that the cricket has warned him, want to see the results. We are invested. We have been hooked into the story. In the new one, he goes to Pleasure Island. And he drinks root beer and tells his best friend, hey, this place isn't all that great and we should be good boys and not do things. And then his friend turns into a donkey and then he leaves. And that's the whole scene. And it's like, nothing, he hasn't acted on his environment. Because he doesn't interact with his environment, because he doesn't do anything with the story, because nothing happens, there's no hook to make us invest in the story. Okay? And to go back to what I said earlier, where I said you could tell this story with him being a moral paragon, here's how. You have him be the good boy who is reluctantly dragged into Pleasure Island. He tells his best friend, hey, I don't know if this is all on the level. His best friend doesn't believe him. And so, he seems out of place. He seems like he's the one in the wrong. And as his friend acts out more and nothing bad happens to him, you have Pinocchio go, okay, maybe I was wrong. Maybe this place is on the level. Maybe it's okay. But then you have Pinocchio see other people transform. Okay? And then he's like, oh my god, I was actually right. So he goes back to his friend and he's like, look, I have proof. I have proof. I've seen it. This place is bad. We need to leave. And then his friend ignores him again and then transforms into a donkey. And so you have him be the moral paragon while also have the hook, because the hook is now, Pinocchio trying and failing to save his friend. And so the lesson becomes, not everybody is going to listen to you just because you're right. Okay? You can't save everyone. Okay? That's a different story, and that's a different morality tale, but it works with him being the same character. Okay? If you were going to tell the story with him being the same character throughout, that's how you tell it. That's how you have the same story beats with a different character. Okay? And you still have a plot there. What you don't do is you don't do what the new movie does, which is you remove all of the morality tale aspects and still try to tell the morality tale. Because you end up with an and then story. And it's really boring. And I'm surprised I've managed to talk this long about it, because it's one of those movies that you just watch and you forget about. Is it bad? Yes. But it's almost worse than being bad, because it's boring. Alright, there are lots of bad movies that are fun to watch or fun to talk about, even if they're terrible. Okay, there are movies that make me angry. And this isn't one of them. Okay, this is not one of those movies that makes me angry, because I didn't really have much invested in Pinocchio to begin with. It's just really boring. It's so boring and so forgettable, and I just don't get it. I don't know why you would remake this movie. It's not even really a remake, like I said. People call it a remake, and everyone, that's the easy way to refer to it, but it's not really a remake. It's its own thing, and it's terrible, essentially. But yeah, that's all I got for this one. I just can't, there's nothing else to say about it. It's not interesting enough to really talk about beyond that. It just pissed me off because it was so boring. Ugh. But yeah, that's Pinocchio. Your story sucks. See y'all next time.